Hi, everyone. I think we're live. This is welcome to the 2021 Slave Dwelling Project Conference, and I'm Fernanda Moore. I'm delighted to introduce Edie Wallace, who's going to be presenting a panel called Revisiting the Tolson Chapel Community, Conversations from Past to Present. Edie is an independent historian and the immediate past president of the Friends of Tolson's Chapel. And take it away.
Okay, well, thank you and welcome everybody. My name is Edie Wallace. Tolson's Chapel and School was built in 1866 by the African American community of Sharpsburg, Maryland. It is a National Historic Landmark, significant as an outstanding example of the community institutions, in this case, church, school, and cemetery, that supported African Americans through Reconstruction and the decades of oppression and segregation that followed. The chapel served as both church and school through 1899 and continued as a church until its closure in 1998. The Friends of Tolson's Chapel is an all-volunteer nonprofit association dedicated to the preservation and interpretation of this important historic resource and the people of the historic Tolson's Chapel community. So thank you for joining us today for this presentation of the Freedom episode. It is the first of what we hope will be 12 episodes in our experiential education video series entitled Revisiting the Tolson's Chapel Community, Conversations from Past to Present. The videos in this series attempt to, quote, narrate hard history honestly, end quote, as Dr. Jeffries so wonderfully articulated yesterday in his keynote address, to give voice to the African Americans who lived that history, and to find the intersections of our past with our present. The episodes are intended to be shared with a live audience in order to stimulate conversations relating historic experience with the issues of today. So in this episode, we examine freedom, beginning with a short documentary that provides a brief historical context of the enslavement of Africans and their American descendants in the U.S. and some of the pathways that individuals took to freedom prior to the American Civil War. The documentary finishes with an examination of the freedom experience of the Sharpsburg African American community that built Tolson's Chapel in 1866 and established the Freedmen's Bureau School there in 1868. Next, you will meet Nancy Camel, born enslaved and later freed by the man who inherited her as property. She lived, worked, and worshiped in and around Sharpsburg her entire life. Nancy Camel's story is reenacted for us today in Tolson's Chapel by Brenda Parker, a historic interpreter at Mount Vernon. As you listen to Nancy's story, we hope you will consider how she experienced freedom and how her view of freedom might relate to your own understanding of, feelings about, or experience with freedom. Or how does Nancy Camel's experience as a free woman, this is before the Civil War, so free is very relative, and the experience of others in the historic African American community relate to the wider social justice conversations of today. At the conclusion of the video presentation, I'll return to introduce our panel of historians and educators who you see here already, to explore these questions and hopefully any questions or comments offered by the audience. In relating our own modern experiences with those of the past, we hope to move our current conversations about race and justice forward and redirect our ideas of historic memory toward a more inclusive past, present, and future. And with that, let's go ahead and play the video.
Welcome, and thank you for joining our experiential learning series entitled Revisiting the Tolson's Chapel Community, Conversations from Past to Present. Tolson's Chapel and School is a National Historic Landmark in Sharpsburg, Maryland, nationally significant for its history as a rural African American community institution, as both church and school built during America's fraught post-Civil War period of Reconstruction. While the building itself is a remarkable reminder of the power of community institutions in difficult times, it is the stories of the men and women who peopled that historic community that speak most clearly to us today. Their stories illuminate their determination and resilience to thrive even as they faced newly achieved freedom after a lifetime of enslavement, discrimination in work opportunities and where they could live, limited land ownership opportunities, restricted political and social interactions, and physical violence. These are social justice issues African Americans still confront today in the 21st century. Thus, the past informs the present, and we hope these conversations with history will guide us toward a future free of injustice and that celebrates the diverse citizens of the United States. Freedom. In 1865, an independent Black Methodist congregation was formed in Sharpsburg, Maryland by Reverend John R. Tolson, a former slave from Virginia. The little church, built by the community in 1866, became known as Tolson's Chapel. Many of the new congregants had been free before the Civil War, but many had labored in bondage. Their journey to freedom was still fresh in their minds. In the years just before the Civil War, nearly 400 African Americans lived in and around the small town of Sharpsburg. As descendants of enslaved Africans brought to American shores since the 1600s, their collective memory was fraught with pain, fear, and the loss of cultural traditions, the trademarks of institutional slavery. Their ancestral homelands in Africa had advanced, well-established traditions of religion, government, art, and industry. Despite this, Europeans and American slave traders kidnapped the Africans and transported them across the Atlantic Ocean, where they were sold into slavery and subjected to unimaginable horrors. Their connections to their African traditions were weakened, and many were destroyed completely. In America, this proud people had to endure a life of forced labor. By the 1850s, many African Americans in Maryland had achieved freedom, either by escaping or more often by legal means. In places like Sharpsburg, where there were no large plantations, African American families often had both free and enslaved members. Some families were able to purchase the freedom of their enslaved spouses or children, rescuing them from slavery. In a few minutes, we will meet one such free woman, Nancy Campbell, or Camel, and hear her story. In the Sharpsburg area, more than 100 African Americans still labored in bondage during the Civil War. They witnessed the terrible Battle of Antietam in 1862, which left the town, its farms, and its people battered. The battle enabled President Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved people in the rebellion states, but not in Maryland. In November of 1864, more than a year after Lincoln's famous proclamation, and while the Civil War still raged, the slave state of Maryland adopted a new state constitution that abolished slavery. Now freedom came to those still enslaved in Sharpsburg. What did it mean to be free in the decades just after the Civil War? Without a doubt, freedom had been the crucial goal, a prize long sought after, with incalculable benefits. Were some things changed for the better after 1865? Yes. Many Western Maryland families who had been separated by slavery were now united. For many, freedom meant self-determination and the ability to act communally, to build their own churches, and to attend schools. However, in many ways, life was much as it had been. Daily labor, homes, and living conditions remained much the same. African Americans in Sharpsburg faced both new and old injustices and uncertainties as free citizens. Many families were still separated. Discrimination and even violence was a daily threat. Many opportunities available to whites remained closed to African Americans. It was difficult for African Americans to flourish economically in Reconstruction era Maryland. Building a good life in freedom remained a challenge. For all these reasons, the Sharpsburg African American community turned more than ever to family, faith, and education as they faced the future. In 1866, they built a log chapel, later named Tolson's Chapel, where they worshiped independently and opened a school. It was a place where they could speak freely and offer mutual support. Tolson's Chapel and school was a symbol of this rural Maryland African American community's resilience and determination to live as free citizens of the United States.
I am Nancy Camel, and I stand at both the dawn and the dusk of a newly formed society. The dawn on the end of the institution of slavery or enslavement for persons that look like myself, persons of African descent. And the dawn of a society where persons that look like myself were able to attain and fight for those same rights of citizenship and liberty like everyone should receive. I guess you might be able to call me a midwife of sorts. And that a born witness I have delivered these particular conditions into the world. But I guess with any good story, it's always best to start at the beginning, because no one except God just is. I was born, or so they tells me, October 15th, 1813. Now when I say they, I'm talking about the family of the Millers. You say, I have no documents, any papers, or anything that says whom my mother or my father might have been, for they did not particularly care about that particular thing. But still, it does not mean that I am not here and that I do not exist. I most definitely am here, and I will tell my tale. Now, working and living on the Miller farms was an experience. I have nothing else to compare it to. You see, round here in Sharpsburg, Maryland, that's where we is. Sharpsburg, Maryland, in Washington County. You know, most people around here are farmers. We grow grains, corn, wheat, rye. The Miller family, we're mostly known for our corn crops. Forgive me, I still find it quite humorous. And that here we are with a trades name like Miller, and we have to grow our crops and take it to a local grist mill and have it ground into meal or flours and things of that sort. At any rate, the farm consists of 180 acres. This 180 acres was inherited by my owner from his father, who was a Dutch immigrant from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. That's right, all the way from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. They come here in the 1820s, I believe it was, or so. At any rate, the farm that I grew up on, the farm that I worked on, the farm that I lived on, was a small farm, and we had just enough to keep us going and to keep everybody alive and well. We would grow our crops just like everyone else and take them to market and take them into town. The occasions of church weddings and funerals and other holidays were so very much looked forward to by myself. I don't know if the rest of the family looked forward to them as much as I did. You see, out here on the farm, there aren't very many people that look like me. And so there in town and church, I got to see and be around my skin folk, even if they weren't kin folk, if you get my meaning. Now, the house that I lived in, the quarters and such, was 1.5 stories, and it was painted white, or whitewashed. It was limestone, and the limestone is so rich in the soils that it makes for very good growing and such. Life moved forward, time moved forward, stopping in different places, and so did I. I went from the hands of one family member to the next family member that I was inherited. You see, this condition of enslavement is an inherited condition here in the Americas, not in the rest of the colonies and other places in the world. Here, the status of the mother determines the status of the child. But in Maryland, oddly enough and wonderfully enough, they instituted their constitution much later, but before then, in 1859, my owners, the persons that I lived with, they did give me my freedom, an article of manumission and such. Now, of course, this particular thing was brought about by the changing minds, the moral compass or mindset of the Church of the Brethren, and that was the church that the family did attend. And afterwards, it was known as the Dunkers Church. I'll tell you more about that momentarily. But he did give me my freedom as a person In 1859, oh glorious day, I am free! But not all of my kinfolk are free. It wouldn't be until much later that the Constitution was declared here in Maryland, articles and such that declared everyone of African descent that was enslaved here free, 1864. But before then, there was a war, a great civil war. And when I say civil, I do not mean peaceful or agreeable. Not at all. It was the exact opposite. You see, very many of the southern territories, the places apart from us, lower than us, and some beside us, remember, Maryland is a border state, and such, had decided to secede from the Union of States. President Lincoln was our president then, and he ascribed that all of the states should gather themselves together with equal forces, equal laws, and such, being that no, there were very many rebellious states, and they chose not to apply these particular laws, for they knew that their livelihood depended upon the labor of hands and bodies that looked like myself. The war came here. It was a very fearful time. We, the family and myself, we did seek shelter in the Dunkers Church, and we sheltered there. For several days, it seemed that the war would never leave us. When we finally returned back to our property, we found bodies scattered about. It was as if a swarm of locusts had come and just dropped right there. Death was a man going around taking names, and he took 800 souls' names there. I remember hours and days of having to dig graves for all those 800 persons. Sorrowful day. And as if that were not enough, the family that I had grown up with, the family that I had come to know and claim as my own, amongst the children, the youngest child, death did linger and did take her as well. But a babe, I think I mourned for her loss as much as a mother did mourn for her loss. I remember there was a woman that was passing through. Very many flights for freedom were taken from the people in other places, coming through Maryland, trying to get to Pennsylvania and to other free states and territories. And this woman, she was singing this song about death. Something she called death, this man, an embodiment of a man. She said he was going around taking names. That's where I got that from. It's going around taking names. See if I can remember that song. There's a man going round taking names. There's a man going round taking names. Well, he took my mama's name, left my heart in pain. There's a man going round taking names. At any rate, he didn't take my name, at least not then. Now, even though I was a free woman of color, there were laws that I had to abide by, one of which proved very, very frustrating to me. You see, even though I had been given my manumission, my freedom, by the family of Peter and such, I was still afforded and required to, every year, petition the Court of Orphans here in Maryland. Yes, here I am, 40 plus years of age, and having to petition the Court of Orphans for permission to stay here in Maryland, the only home I've ever known, the place where I was born. Now, blessedly enough for me, I did have one of the Miller men come and speak on my behalf. He said that I had never given them any trouble and I was always a good worker. And he was the husband of Miss Margaret Ann Miller Roulette. After that time, I chose, yes, I chose to remain on and in the employ of the Miller family, Roulette family. And I worked. I put my hands to the soil, to the needle thread, whatever it is I could find. I kept myself gainfully occupied, and I actually acquired money for my labors. So very much money at the end of my life to where I had amassed near about $800 in certain personal possessions, things of furniture pieces and bedsteads and bed linens and the like. I even got myself a Bible, and now I don't know how to read it, but still, just having it is right nice. And so, when time started to grow upon me, I knew that I needed to start making plans for my life afterward. And those persons whom I would hold responsible for most everything that I had acquired here on this earth. You cannot take these possessions along with you. I don't think there's anything that I would like to take with me. So I have my will drawn up. And I place as executor, of course, the husband of Margaret Ann, being that they done right by me. And because they was the only family that I'd known, the family that I chose, I decided to leave them most everything, save for the Bible. The Bible, I leave to Tolson's chapel. Goodness. It seems as if my time here on earth was just but a moment, fleeting moment. I have left very little to account for my presence. But one thing I wish to leave with you is that I was here. I occupied space and time. I had hopes and dreams. I had sorrows and fears, same as everybody else. And my name is Nancy Camel. Will you tell my story?
Okay, it looks like we're back. And so I'd like to introduce our panel for discussion. So Brenda Parker, who you just saw reenacting Nancy Camel, one of the historic members of the Tolson's Chapel congregation. Brenda Parker is a self-titled historian and character interpreter at George Washington's Mount Vernon. There she occupies the newly designed title of African American Interpretation and Special Projects Coordinator. She uses her almost 17 years of employment with the MVLA to the benefit of visitors, experience, and education of guests. She works closely with the descendant community, history interpreters, education, archaeology, historic trades, and others invested in assuring that the lives of the enslaved community at Mount Vernon are more inclusively and accurately portrayed. Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
Our next panelist, Bridget Jones-Smith, is a community educator and advocate. She is vice president of the board of directors of the Friends of Tolson's Chapel. Mrs. Jones-Smith first learned of Tolson's Chapel over a decade ago when she was leading a group of young artists on an exploration of African American cemetery art. She is passionate about learning and sharing the accurate history of the African diaspora. I don't see Bridget. Is she there?
Yes.
Do we have video of Bridget?
Yes.
Yes.
Our next panelist, Emily, is Dr. Emily Ampt. She is an emeritus professor at Hood College in Frederick, Maryland, and an award-winning writer of African American history. Her forthcoming book about African American experiences of the Battle of Antietam will be published in the summer of 2022 by the History Press. She is also working on a book about slavery in Western Maryland. She blogs at www.emilyampt.com. Dr. Ampt is a current member of the Friends of Tolson's Chapel Board of Directors. And I also don't see Emily.
Oh,
I'm
here.
hoping that we'll get these videos back.
Can we see her?
Our next panelist is Zunny Miller-Matima. She is a Friends of Tolson's Chapel board member and chair of the Black Reference Response Committee. She is a retired world history instructor and CEO of AfroAsia, the Intercultural Education Exchange. Zunny is a professional reenactor, former member of the Capitol Ballet Guild, and a lifelong scholar, historian, former XM satellite radio talk show host, and director of transformational theater experiences. And I just will add that Zunny is also one of the descendant community for Mount Vernon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it says everybody can see everybody else but me. Okay. And finally, my name, of course, is Edie Wallace. I am an independent historian. I am currently working primarily with the Organization of American Historians in cooperation with the National Park Service. My most recent report, a special history study of the rural African American experience in the National Capital Area from 1865 to 1900, is scheduled to be published later this fall. I am a founding member and immediate past president of the Friends of Tolson's Chapel, located in Sharpsburg, Maryland, and I will be acting today as our panel moderator. So thank you, panelists, and welcome. I'm hoping that we will get some comments or questions from the audience as we begin this discussion.
Excellent.
So I'd like to start panel with a question that I'd like each of you to answer, but I'll start with Brenda. And that question is, what do you think freedom meant to Nancy Campbell? She was enslaved and later freed. How do you think she viewed her freedom? And you can also expand that to some of the other enslaved people or free people that you are familiar with from Mount Vernon.
Excellent. Thank you.
Go
I'd be
ahead.
happy to answer that. Yes, I believe that Nancy Campbell, in my interpretation and my decisions how to narrate her life, that she viewed freedom as a different day, but the same stuff. Meaning that there were some privileges and some rights that were given to her as far as freedom was concerned that were pretty much the same restrictions were imposed upon her, to where she was at that one point where she expresses the frustration and having to apply to petition to the Court of Orphans, for permission to stay in that state. And that was the case being in so many other different places. Virginia, I know that for a fact, every 3 years, I believe it was, that they had to go and like renew their manumission papers, or so basically saying, I'm still here, I'm still in this area, still, count me on this census as far as being, here in this area. So they knew for governmental tax purposes where you were and things of that particular nature. I think the only thing that I might have hopefully wished for Nancy to have been excited about in freedom was joining with the Freedmen's Bureau and working with them in them designing the school and opening up the school and everything, but perhaps the opportunity to try to locate any family members that she might have possibly had. That was a very disappointing and heartbreaking reality that I came across when comprising her narrative and her story, was that we have a birth date and a date of death, but we have very little else to go along with her existence and her being here, in our timeline and everything. And that's also something that I take on a regular basis for the the personage of Caroline Branham, who is the descendant of Zunny Matsima Miller. She is the descendant of Caroline Branham there at Mount Vernon, and that we don't know who her mother was. We don't know if she had any other siblings. So I made a conscious decision to expand her narrative to give her a beginning, saying that she was born there at Mount Vernon. Her mother was an enslaved woman by the name of Jemima. I intentionally chose the name Jemima, which is also amongst the name of the 6 children that she had at one particular time, and saying that she bore the name of her grandmother. Her grandmother passed, so she's passing on this name. So her mother would always be there with her. And in doing that, I am opening up the door for conversations about, sometimes these persons just appear in inventory records at the age of 15 or at the age of 16, once they become tithable. Once the owner or the enslaver starts to is required to pay taxes on them as property. And so that's one of the things that I have to deal with in my narration, and making it clear to people that are in the audience that what we see as other human beings across from us and with us and around us, they were not seen as human beings in that time period, but they were seen as possessions, the same as a chair, a horse, a dog, a cat. And they were passed around and they were treated like possessions in people's wills and people's deeds and things of that particular sort. So big capsulate, it was the same, different, but the same. It was more of the exact same, because number one, she was a woman and she was living in a very isolated region of the world. So the only support she had was there at the church. So I think that's what Nancy thought about freedom.
So we seem to have lost, Edie seems to have lost us. So I'm going to just punt it over to Bridget next. Bridget, what do you think freedom meant to Nancy Camel?
So I think for Nancy, freedom and the idea of freedom was a mixed bag. Certainly she loved the ideal of freedom, and when she got her freedom, she was happy, but I think she was very aware of the limitations of that freedom. She had been forced in isolation by her enslavers, the family that kept her enslaved all of those years. And so her greatest joy, as Brenda had portrayed, was to be able to go to the church or go to town so she could see other Black people. But in her freedom and her employ with the family, she still had those same limitations. She could only see those people when she went to church or when she went to town. And she was in a position where she eventually was manumitted. She got her freedom from her enslavers, but where was she to go? She saw other people who had gotten their freedom through manumission and after the war through emancipation. And those people, those families, many of them could reunite with each other, or they were free to move about, to find other people, to have their own agency. But she had none of that because she had been kept in that forced isolation all of those years, and also because she was a woman. And where was her family, and how would she, in her circumstance, be able to begin to even move about at her will? So for her, I think freedom was a mixed bag.
Sunny, do you want to talk about freedom and Nancy Campbell?
Sure. The thing about freedom is, what can you do with freedom? So if in fact you have been freed as a political statement, but you have been deprived of education and the resources to take care of yourself and your family, if in fact you knew where your family was, if they hadn't been sold off, then what can you do with freedom? So many people just sat by the roadside. They were told, you're free, get out. Some plantation owners and slaveholders may have said, here's a little bread or something like that, or something minuscule that they were willing to share. But the main thing is, where do you go? What do you do? So my feeling about freedom for Nancy Campbell is that where she decided to go was where she'd been, which was back to the family that had enslaved her. She had kinship of some sort with them. And I think she thought, well, this is my life now. And it's not altogether an unhappy thing, but it is certainly, it may not be the celebration of her dreams, because we don't really know. She was a quiet woman. She did a lot of nice things, apparently, for other people, well known for her baking goods and things like that. So she comforted people, is what I'm feeling from her. But, who comforted her? Was it just in the taking care of the children from the family that owned her? So freedom is a very delicate thing. It can only become robust when you can make decisions, all of the decisions that you require in order to become stable, have serenity and security. And honestly, I don't think she had that. She would not have had it on her own. She had it by going back with the family that enslaved her, yes. And so she dies and she leaves things behind, something to the daughter. She left the Bible to Tolson's. But, whatever happened to the rest of her money is conjecture, because we only assume she left it in a will to the family. But that tells a lot about the relationships that people had during enslavement, because anyway, the family took it, no matter how it was supposedly given or received. And that's a big thing, is the manipulation that we have with those, by those, I should say, in power. So it really is, it's really something to contemplate, none of us will really know because we have relative freedom, but we can't even begin to understand what it meant to them to be bound, body, and in some cases, mind, or at least intellect, by others. So that's my feeling about freedom for Nancy Kemp.
So I'm going to take the question now myself, and I think you guys have covered it so well. I'm going to just broaden it out a little bit to the people I've studied who were other members of the Tolson's Chapel community and other people in the county. And I know we've all talked about this together when we were preparing the episode and other times. And I know you've contributed on this topic too, but one of the things that always strikes me is the freedom from fear of sale and the freedom from fear of the families being split up. That was one of the things that hung over enslaved families here in Washington County. And we tend, I think people who don't know much about Western Maryland don't think of it as a place where slave sales happened a lot, even people who live here who haven't looked at the history, but it was subject to the internal slave trade, just as other places in Maryland were. And that happened regularly, and families were split up, and members were sold away to the Deep South, or even just sold across the state, or across the county, which did separate families. And young people were sold away from their parents. Married couples were split up. One spouse sold to Louisiana, and that was the end for that family for being together. So I think that freedom meant for families that they could stay together. For an individual, freedom meant that she or he no longer had to fear being sold. And even when they were confident or had good relations with their enslavers, they never really knew that enslaver wouldn't sell them. So freedom was, among many other things, freedom meant an end to that fear if everybody could get sold. And one of the things we have in Sharpsburg is a lot of records of people who free people who bought family members out of slavery. So it clearly was something that African American families valued and put a high price on.
Yeah, it's definitely it falls under the label of psychological torture. I think we had discussed one time before, Bridget, and probably with Sunny as well, we were talking about the effects of, or the label of, Stockholm syndrome. To where how the captors in Holland, in Stockholm, Holland, by the end of their captivity, they were actually identifying with, fighting for, and on the side of those persons that had held them as hostages, initially. And so you see that in so many different cases, so many different references and stories and narratives of these persons. I might also add that
it's a survival mechanism.
It is a survival technique, whether, you choose to identify with your captors or whatever it is, whatever way that you can find to survive, that's what you're doing. That's basically what you're doing. But also adding to the simple fact that they had laws that said that you had to show that you were employed by somebody. And so that, that era that we come into, after Civil War with Reconstruction, and then immediately you go into Jim Crow legislation that says you have to be employed by somebody. You have to show proof of employment. So, this was, a little bit before then. And as Sunny had said, that, you had people that were just sitting by the, side of the road. Where am I going to go? What am I to do? With that kind of mentality, that kind of mindset. But you also had those other persons that were, very much like, in Nancy's case, to where she was You know, she was like, well, this is the only home I've ever known. This is the only reality I've ever known. And I felt like she was strongly attached to those children, that she was
Yeah.
raising those children. You know, she was thinking of those children as her children, you know, even
Mhm.
though they didn't come from her body.
Yeah.
And so that was another reason why she probably did not go very far, because those were her
And
babies. Mhm.
and I'll tell you something else too, which is amazing, but is rarely taken into uh, the story of enslavement, not just in Washington County, but all over the country. And that is that we have yet to really understand or estimate the number of indigenous or native people who were enslaved by the thousands, I want you to know, not a couple here and a couple there, but by the early European colonizers came in and kidnapped, in fact, started wars or created wars among the tribes, and then took the prisoners off as captives for enslavement, some sent as far away as Haiti. So, you know, I guess what I want to say with all of that, and I'm sorry for the shaking of the camera, but this is handheld at this point. We are doing the best we can, okay? Okay. But when I reenact people from enslavement, I always say Afri-Indios or some combination of the two, because the truth of it is, it's hard for us to know. Why? Because many of the indigenous people were described as being very dark. And I know that many native people come into the cities and say, why is it that so many of these people look like native people? I didn't know you had such a large indigenous population. For us to say, no, 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 those are African Americans. They say, no, listen, I know what an indigenous face looks like. These are native people. So I'm just telling you that this has a lot to do with what happened to them during slavery, because we think that they were just separated from their families and they went, you know, wherever. But we forget that there were not only Africans, but tribal affiliations that were disrupted. And they were not able to just run home through the woods to their home, to where they lived. They may have been taken far across the shores from Georgia, Florida, and all places, and brought up here into the Northeast. So many of your people that you're looking at, that you're saying, oh, these were our ancestors here in Washington County. Yet some of them may have been your indigenous people who had become, quote unquote, colored, or at least identified paper genocide as colored. So we've lost a lot of freedoms by this. Freedom of identification, as well as all of the other limitations.
Yeah. Okay, so we have another question to throw out to the panel. We have a comment from our audience that says, that agrees, Zuni, that there is who's commenting twice and thankful for this conversation, because the questioner says, as you can see now, that there's a lot of anti-Blackness that has happened in Native spaces, white spaces, and he's also thankful for this conversation, because a lot of his elders who are Afro-Caribbean have noted this for a long time, and he just learned the history of others who were exiled in King Philip's War to the West Indies.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep an eye. I think I and Fernanda are both going to keep an eye on the chat and see if there are any questions that come up. But I'm meanwhile going to throw out our second question for the panel, which is, what does freedom mean to you, and what do you think it means in American society today compared to the past? This is our second canned question, just to keep the conversation going. I'm going to throw it to Bridget first.
So freedom is very valuable as a construct. The idea of having your own agency. I can do what I want. I have the means to do what I want to better myself and my family, to move my family and my heritage forward. So that is what, for me, it is. In America, we have the opportunity to see other communities going about freely. They have the means or the ability to secure the means to move their family and their heritage forward with all types of societal support. In the African American community, we don't have that same ability, or at least that ability at the same level. We see that our freedom is aggressively infringed upon economically, politically, through voter suppression, through educational inequality, through police brutality, and even social manipulation of our family and family structures. It is because freedom is a valuable tool to move a people forward. But in the age of social media, inequality is glaring. It's hard to dismiss. So it can't be hidden. The freedoms that other communities enjoy, and then the hindrances or encroachment upon those same freedoms for African Americans and others. I think, though, that the desire for equality is ingrained in all American societies because that's what we were taught. We are the free country. This land is your land. This land is my land. You know, we learned the songs, even though the practice was not there. But that desire for equality is ingrained in all communities. And I think because of the connectedness that we experience through media, it keeps that desire and that fight robust. I think freedom and the fight for freedom is going to remain a robust activity in America. And I'm interested actually in seeing how that's going to play out. Who's going to win this fight for freedom? So those are my comments for right now.
Okay.
And those are wonderful comments, I must add. Oh, who should go? Should I go next?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, all right, thank you. I think my picture just left. I don't know where my picture is. Can anybody see me? Oh, okay.
We see you and hear you.
All right, it's okay. I can see myself now, so it's all right. Listen, here's the point. What does it mean to me? What it means to me is that we have yet to throw off a lot of the shackles, given that we are still making progress by way of education and employment. You know, we still have the shackles and remnants of colonization. I mean, there's no two ways about it. You know, you're going to have to be honest about it. I'm honest about it every day.
Yeah.
We know that white privilege exists, and we also know that it definitely is a resounding negative sound within the African American community. We see the freedoms lost when we have juxtaposed two pictures, one of an African American that might be stopped for a minor traffic violation, and a white that has been stopped. And we know that the chances are that the African American or Afri-Native, because we don't know what the bloodline really is, we know how mixed they were, that person will end up on the ground. We know that. You know, I remember coming back from Gettysburg. I was doing a reenactment there, and I was stopped. Okay, so maybe I was going a little bit fast. I don't know. I was trying to get home. I was tired. But anyway, the police officer pulled me over, and I said to him, I said, "Now, I just want to ask you something. Am I going to end up on the ground?" And he was shocked. But you see, that is an unfortunate expectation. That is a freedom that we cannot count on. We cannot count on justice or fairness or equity in this system. So the presence of our color of our skin immediately denotes that you may not be treated as well. And that's a remnant from slavery. So that's where we are. That's what freedom means to us today. It means safeguarding yourself and persevering in spite of the fact that you probably won't be treated justly, even with education.
Yeah. Exactly.
Brenda?
I will go. She, both of my beautiful colleague elders, they said exactly what I was thinking. Freedom to me means justice.
Oh,
It simply means justice. It means receiving the exact same fair treatment as any other citizen, as any other human being. Simple as that. I am like ridiculously, yeah, who is going to win this fight for freedom? I am
yes.
ridiculously frustrated constantly. And even in my own like living, environments or working environments, to where I do see the differences, the inequality that is so
Mhm.
blatant, and and pointing it out, causes a little bit of discontent, or disturbance, when you do point it out. And then I always have that concern that I'm going to end up, occupying one of those racial stereotypes as the angry black woman. And and then there are days where I'm just like going, you know what, I'm going to take on that stereotype today. I'm going to be the angry black woman. I'm going to be angry because justice is not being served. Justice is being denied,
Mhm.
to so many people. And when you
Mhm.
keep seeing it constantly over and over and over again, it it does more to rile me up, to where I see it everywhere, and every time I see it, I try to point it out. I just point it out. I point it out. I point it out. I point it out. With the
Mhm.
hopes that somebody that has more power than me, somebody that has a voice that's actually heard, will actually pick up that concern and do something about it. So I'm happy that we do have social media today, because people like Joseph McGill, our fabulous host, and everything, he often posts these questions out there in social media platforms. I
Mhm.
myself have made apologies. I've called my own self out on my actions, the latest of which was, every time, a white woman goes missing, or, she's killed or abused or whatever it is, how that's the leading news story. But we know that there are millions, if not, thousands, if not millions, of indigenous women that go missing, that are abused, that are kidnapped, that are raped, that are transported across state lines on a regular basis. And
Right.
that should be flooding our news outlets every single day. The same thing with little black and brown children, how they go missing, how they're abused, how they're neglected, how these women are, are battered, and they're in unhealthy domestic situations. That should be leading
Right.
our news. The same
Mhm.
thing with when I just recently discovered that a lot of the people that were coming across the Mexican border, as well as the Haitian immigrants, to where they said, okay, we'll let you out of detention, but first we have to sterilize you.
Oh, oh.
And having that happening,
Yeah.
and still happening
Mhm.
today,
Mhm.
that's what freedom looks like to me.
Mm-hmm.
The justice. There is no justice in that. Somebody still can say, I will let you go free, but you will no longer have the opportunity to reproduce. Something's wrong with the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, freedom to me is justice.
Yeah.
It's what, people actually getting what they deserve, when they deserve it, to the amount that they deserve it, with no discrimination whatsoever, and no amount of money being able to buy them out of whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, and we have a question here for what we're going to engage with in just a moment. Joseph McGill, and I may have missed one of our panelists saying this, because it sounds like he picked it out of something one of the panelists said, but I'm gonna seize the panelist privilege here for a moment and also engage with this question we're working on, which is, what does freedom mean in American society today? Because I think there's an elephant in the room, and as the white lady on the panel at the moment, I'm going to talk about it, because I don't have the same experiences that my sisters on the panel have, And when I hear freedom, most often, right now, today, it's with people who are very privileged, talking about freedom and talking about it in a way that there's no responsibility whatsoever. And it's talking about freedom as being free from taking responsibility for our community and our society. Oh, yes, indeed. Brenda's got it. Brenda's got it. Yeah. And so I think that, being historians, we really have a perspective on this about people who have bled and died and sacrificed for a very real personal freedom, but it's also a communal freedom. Nancy Camel may have been a single woman without family, but she had a sense of community at Tolson's and at her, and the rest of the communities she lived and worked in. And the other people that we study, they bought their families out of freedom. They risked their lives and their families' lives so that they and their families could be free, so that they and their created families could be free. They never thought of freedom as an individual thing and screw the rest of you. And I think that we would do well to learn from them and to learn, for example, from soldiers who, when they are fighting for freedom, for our freedom or our protection, are also very mindful of their comrades in arms, their buddies, and so on. Freedom is not and should not be a selfish thing. And so I think that when we hear about it today in America, it is very often a selfish thing. And the people we're talking about and studying and honoring with this conference and with the work we do, we're not selfish about freedom. And I think that to honor them, that's what we need to keep in mind. One of the many things we need to keep in mind. So, thank you, Brenda. Little chat we're having here privately. Joe, who has put up our question, will maybe lead us in the next direction. Who is going to win this fight for freedom? I think maybe he picked it out of something while I was doing backstage stuff.
Zunny had said it.
Zunny said it. Okay.
Yeah, she said, Zunny. I don't know who's going to win. I know who's going to win. I know who's going to win. There is an African parable, a proverb that says, if you wish to travel fast, go alone. But if you wish to travel far, go together. The people that rally together, this group of all of these faces right here and the initials right there, all of us, we're going to win this fight for freedom because we are all in it together. The last part of the Pledge of Allegiance that I used to say in school, that you used to say in school, everybody in this panel, we're old enough to have remembered when we used to, in our morning devotions, in the morning meetings, everybody would put their hand over their heart and they would pledge allegiance to the flag. The last sentence, it says, with liberty and justice for all. It does not say with liberty and justice for the people that only make $100,000 and above. with liberty and freedom for the people that went to Ivy League schools, the people that live in this particular zip code. It says for all. So that means that we all have to be concerned with each other. We all need to extend our hands and say, where I'm going, you're welcome to come along with me. If we have to walk, if we have to crawl, we're going, and we're going together.
Hand in hand.
That's Brenda's personal take on who's going to win the fight for freedom. It's not going to be an individual. It's going to be collective.
Okay. Bridget?
As to who's going to win? As to who's going to win?
Uh-huh.
I do not think it is wise to underestimate the will of people who can see freedom. One of the things that has happened with social media and media in general is that we all can see everything. And so I think the will of the oppressed will prevail. As a parent, it is imperative that there is freedom for my child. It is imperative. As an African American, it is imperative that my people, that I and my people experience freedom. I don't think that type of drive can be suppressed. So I think we will win with concrete steps and education. Education of not just the oppressing society, but those in our own society who seem not to see the need for true freedom. For those who have gotten to a certain level in society and they feel they're accepted, and so those people become the hardest in our own community. They become the hardest to pull along because, hey, I'm okay. I don't want to rock this boat. But for the others who have not been accepted or who may have reached a level of acceptance, but they understand it's not just about me, you can't beat that desire. And so I think eventually those on the side of justice will win, who I consider myself and my community, the Black community, on the side of justice.
And I would just add that I guess I was the one that said who will win, but I must say this, until and unless there is accurate history, and I don't mean just local history, I don't just mean American history, I mean world history. Until there is fairness and a retelling of what is already known in many archived editions of literature that really dispels the myths that we are manipulated by. And until that begins, and it is coming out, there's no doubt about it, but until that really comes forth and we treat each other with that respect, because there's enough of good things that have been done by everyone. The only thing that's been suppressed is what has happened to people who look like you, Brenda, Bridget, myself. They're the only ones where the information, the education, the truth of who they were, is told. I just think we've got to start looking at some of these European kings. We've got to start seeing that they were indeed people that look just like the three of us. And we've got to stop trying to pretend that we don't know that. And we have to stop allowing people to take the color, the melanin out of the pigmentation of the paints that they use and making them look fair, or changing their hair and making it wavy when it really looked like what they would call a very kinky or curly hair. We've got to stop doing that. And that's when there will be justice and fairness. Because then when you look in your history books and the class is discussing it, everybody will know, hey, we've all done wonderful things. We've all created things. Oh, hey, I didn't know you invented that. Okay, here's what my people did. Hey, we're all great. That's when it will change. That's when we'll win. Brenda.
So this has been great. I'm going to take a question from the audience.
Okay.
And that is from Gabriel, who commented earlier. And he wants to ask us, I think this is for you guys, you ladies on the panel. How do we handle it? How do we handle it when other African or Afro-Native peoples find themselves being told by other African or Afro-Native natives that they focus on race too much? And there's a little more, he says, which you can see over in the sidebar chat, but that's basically it. Oh,
Wow.
Zuni. Oh, Brenda. Oh, Bridget. Oh, Zuni. You are always talking about race.
Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it, because I always want to question those people. Is this a problem with you? And why is it a problem with you? Because if it didn't upset the person, number one, then they wouldn't mention it. And number two, why does it make you uncomfortable when I talk about my race? Are you saying that you have a problem with me? So that's why I talk about, my race, because it is important to so many of the conversations that we have, so many of the dialogues, so many of our behaviors, so many implicit biases that we're all acting out on a daily basis that we don't even realize, that have been embedded in us and been conditioned in us, and that have been put into our minds that we're supposed to be fearful of this person because of their skin tone, or we're supposed to not trust this person because of their skin tone or their national, their origin or their ethnicity, or these people culturally are, a lower in education, or, this, that, and the other. So, yeah, I kind of welcome it when somebody says, you're always playing the race card, because my race is always here, and everything that you do and everybody else does is on
Mhm.
account of the race of the skin that I'm occupying. So, yeah,
And
have confidence in that, Gabriel.
yeah, but I just want to say, I heard what I'm hearing Gabriel say is when other African or Afro-Native people
Correct.
tell
Oh,
it. And I can tell you,
yeah,
we traveled, three of us traveled around the country with the painted gourd, red and black voices. And let me tell you something, more times than I would like to recall, we had African American people come up to us after the shows and say, well, I just don't know. I mean, why do you talk about it from that vantage point? Why don't you just, why do you want it to be Afri-Native? Why do you want, and here's what I want to say. Manipulation, political and educational manipulation. People find a comfort set somewhere and they realize, or they've accepted, hey, I'm black, I'm African American, and I really don't want to be disturbed. I don't want to think about the fact that I have other bloodlines and what that might mean, and whether I should be accountable to them or them to me. And the only reason why you have any kind of adversity among Native people and African people is because of white manipulation. You know, that's why, because they tried for years and are still trying in some cases to have Native people believe that they are not in the same class or group as African Americans, knowing that the identification, the ethnic identification, was changed on paper by Plecker, for one, who was the registrar of Virginia for maybe 25, 30 years. I mean, it's a farce. It's a myth, and we've bought into it, and we need to stop it. We need to come together and realize what has happened. That's why I say there won't be real change until the truth of history is known.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
the times that I've run into other African Americans that have expressed that to me, Bridget, why? Can you give this a rest? Give this a rest. And my response really is, and whether or not I share that with them, my internal response to that and to people like that is, when I come home at night, I have a tall, dark husband. My son is a short, dark, black young man. He's 18. All of my, well, not all, but many of my family are African Americans, as am I. Though education and socioeconomics gives us a small measure of comfort that other people may not have, when we walk out the door, nobody knows that. Nobody knows that. Larger society does not know that. So I always have to not play the race card, but live my life being seen as a Black woman. I live my life being seen that way because I can't be unseen. Contrary to what people will tell you, there is no colorblind society. And those people that say, in my opinion, that say I don't see color are not honest. It's possible not to see my color as opposed to someone else's. And so because that is my everyday reality, and I know many people that don't have the measure of of economics or education that my family has been blessed with, for those people and for me, because that none of that will save me when I walk down the street in an unknown place. That's why it comes up. Whether or not I choose to share my rationale with those people, that's a lot of energy for people that are so comfortable or want to be so comfortable that they can forget everybody else. So a lot of times I don't even bother with the conversation with them. I fight my fight. I express what I'm going to express. I do my work and I keep it moving.
Yeah. Again, it comes back to those implicit biases, how people behave and
Right.
function around you and how it affects you is directly related to the skin that we're in, the
Exactly.
skin that we're functioning in,
Mhm.
and we can't get around it. I mean, that's something that I talk about with, when I'm narrating Caroline's life. I talk about Caroline's boy, Wilson. And he's 15 years old and he's so excited because he's been given the position, the title of a footman. So he gets to wear this fancy livery of white and red. And he was strutting around and he was so proud of himself that one particular day. And he says, "Mama, call me by my name." And she says, "You're my boy Wilson." He says, "No, no, 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 no. That's not good enough. Call me by my title, what I do." And she says, "Okay, you're Wilson the footman." And he says, "No, no, 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 no. That's still not good enough for him." And he says, "Call me by my fancy French title," as if that was the supreme and the ultimate. And she says, "What's that?" He says, "Mama, I'm a postillion." And she, of course, cuts him down to size and says, "Postilion, my posterior, you know, you're my boy Wilson, the same boy that I gave birth to, you know?" And then I go on to say that he seems to think that just because he has a fancy title and he has fancy clothes, that he's better than or different than all the other people that are considered as property here. And she goes on to tell them, "Sweetie, when you lay your head down at the end of the day, you're still that same piece of property, that same person that somebody's going to call as property." I said, "But you matter. Your position here on this earth matters because you are my child, because you are a great big brother, because you're my son named Wilson." All of these things to just remind him that his presence here matters, regardless of whatever label somebody gives him, regardless of
Right.
what job he has, regardless of how big his house is or how small it is. These are those superficial things that a lot of people in society want to glom onto instead of saying, "I'm a human being. My existence, my presence here matters. Somebody loves me. Somebody cares about me. There's a reason why I was born." Simple as that. Strip away all the material culture, strip away all the possessions, and get down to who you are. You are a human being occupying a space and time in Black skin.
And there is no accident as to who comes
No,
into your life. When
none.
they come in, they're either there to educate you or to help you along in your way in some way. They are there to help you. And Brenda, when I hear you talking about Caroline and Wilson, it's funny. I try to listen to it as if it's a story, and I realize those are my.
Those are
It's
your
funny, my
ancestors.
ancestors. I mean,
Those are
I
your
was
people.
enthralled, and then I realized, oh, wait a minute, those are my ancestors she's talking about. So that's it, though. That's the story, and we are all storytellers, aren't we? Every
Yes.
one of us. You've got an author here, a well-read, well-researched. Emily. Emily is an author, and authors are storytellers.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
And so
Historians are storytellers.
So we're all everyone on the conference, because whatever you hear here, you may share with someone else. We're storytellers, and we have to continue to tell the stories.
Of
So
other human beings.
of other human beings. Well, I don't know. It comes to me, it might be angels, but I think you're right. Of other human beings, exactly.
Okay, of other spiritual beings.
I like that. I
Beings
like that.
with souls, because we all have souls.
That's right. Absolutely.
And I think that that's a really good note to wrap up on. We're at 3:24. We're supposed to go, no later than 3:30. And I think that brings us around to what this panel has tried to show, how at Tolson's Chapel, which was a spiritual home for spiritual and physical beings.
Yes.
It was we are as the Friends of Tolson's Chapel trying to find a new way to tell the story of these people, this community. And this program, the Freedom episode, is the first of a number of episodes that we're putting together, which have the video documentary and then a reenactor telling the, recreating a person's life story and presenting that, and then a panel discussion to bring it into a conversation with the present in a live dialogue. And so I hope that the audience today has seen this demonstration of how we are trying to craft a program, which was born out of the pandemic and the necessity for doing this at a distance, but that we think has potential to live on into a non-pandemic future, we hope. And we'll probably be also doing this in person, live at our site, but with our digital technology, we have the potential to reach so many more people. And as you can see, the people doing this at Tolson's have unique talents and perspectives and are telling, I hope, a universal story. A universal story. So thank you all for coming, and thanks very much to
Thank
the
you for
wonderful
having
panelists.
us.
here
Goodbye, and
today.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Slave Dwelling Project. Thank you,
Yes,
Josie.
Thank you for having us, Slave
thank
Dwelling
you so much.
Project.
Be well.
That's right.